The party was packed. Twinkling lights reflected off raised glasses, lively conversations filled the room, and laughter echoed amid the music that dictated the rhythm of the evening. I watched from afar with a rehearsed smile, holding the glass of wine that seemed to be my only company that night. While everyone was celebrating, something in me was about to fall apart. It was impossible to ignore, she was dancing with him. It was more than a dance. It was the connection, the glances, the hands that took a little longer than they should have to meet. Every movement felt like a stab. My place next to her, which I had fought so hard to build over the years, seemed like a distant memory. I could have pretended not to see it, but the truth was that I already knew. It wasn't just a slip or a moment of weakness, it was a pattern, a choice she had made over and over again, and that night, in front of everyone, it was as if she had decided to rub it in my face. "Why don't you dance with your wife?" Someone commented with a playful smile, probably trying to be friendly. I swallowed and forced a laugh. "She looks busy," I replied, feeling the bile rise in my throat as I looked away from the scene that seemed to torture me. But I wouldn't look away for long. There was something in that moment, a repressed anger, a desire for justice that invaded me. I knew what needed to be done. It was no longer about saving our marriage. It wasn't about her anymore. It was about me. About finally freeing myself from the burden of bearing alone the responsibility for something she had destroyed. She laughed. The music changed, and they continued to twirl around, as if they were the protagonists of a romantic scene. And maybe they were, at least in her mind. But at that moment, something in me broke. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't despair. It was raw, burning determination. I walked to the center of the hall, my mind buzzing with the words that were about to come out of my mouth. Words that, I knew, would change our lives forever. "I want to make an announcement," my voice echoed through the hall, and the murmur of conversation died down until there was only silence. She stopped dancing, looking at me with an expression that mixed confusion and a twinge of fear. Her lover tried to disguise it by moving away, but the damage had already been done. All eyes were on me, and I felt the weight of tension in the air, as if time had frozen. "This will be the last party we attend as husband and wife." The words came out firmer than I expected, cutting through the silence like a blade. "I'm asking for a divorce. And let me be clear, this decision is a direct result of the choices she has made." The room erupted in murmurs and exclamations. She was paralyzed, as if she didn't know what to say. Her lips moved, but no words came out. Her lover, visibly uncomfortable, tried to sneak out, but the stares followed him like a spotlight. "No," she finally shouted, running towards me. "Please don't do it here, not like this." Her voice was hoarse, and I could see the desperation in her eyes. Despair not for me, but for public embarrassment. That was what she feared more than anything. "Enough," I said, my voice cold and cutting. "No more lies. No more excuses. I spent years pretending I didn't see. Years of trying to ignore the deleted messages, the lame excuses, the schedules that didn't make sense. But today you made it clear who you are." She shook her head, tears starting to flow. "I made a mistake, I know, but we can fix it." "We can." "No," I interrupted her, my voice rising a tone. "I've already fixed everything I can. I've tried. I tried harder than you deserved. But today, you danced your last dance while still using my last name." The silence took over the room again, heavy and oppressive. The faces around us were a mixture of shock, pity, and morbid curiosity. But I didn't care. For the first time in years, I felt in control. What they didn't know, what no one there knew, was that I wasn't just asking for a divorce. For weeks, I had been preparing for this moment. I had talked to lawyers, transferred assets, organized my departure impeccably. Every penny she thought she would have access to was gone in a matter of days. The shares, the house, everything was protected. And she, well, she would have to start again from scratch, just like I would. But there was a difference, I would have my dignity intact. She, just the shards of what she once thought she controlled. As I left the hall, the sound of her sobs echoing behind me, I knew that this was just the first scene of a much bigger show. What would she do when she found out she had nothing? That her betrayal had cost her not only her marriage, but also the life she knew. The thought made me stop for a moment. I turned around, watching her from afar as she was consoled by friends who were probably just as shocked as she was. Something in her expression made me realize that she still didn't know. She didn't know how deep the blow would be. And I couldn't wait to see the truth come out. After all, the dance had only just begun. Welcome to our channel. Here, we never support or tolerate any form of betrayal. The stories you hear are fictional, created to show how betrayal can destroy lives, relationships and dreams. Our aim is to provoke reflection and deep emotions. Get ready now for a shocking story, full of twists and turns, where the truth always takes its toll. Good story. Spotlights bathed the hall in gold and silver tones, illuminating a setting that looked like it was straight out of a luxury magazine. Musicians tuned their instruments while waiters circulated with trays of gleaming glasses, and the murmur of conversation mixed with light, elegant laughter. Among the guests, the host couple, Richard and Emily, stood out. He, a respected businessman, with a naturally charismatic air that seemed to magnetize everyone around him. She, a woman of striking presence, dressed in a red dress that seemed tailor-made for the moment. They were, at least in the eyes of those watching from the outside, the epitome of a perfect wedding. Richard watched Emily from afar as she greeted a group of guests. Her smile was impeccable, but he knew how well Emily had mastered the art of masking her emotions. There had been something in the last few months, a subtle distancing that he couldn't name, but which hung like a shadow over them both. The party was supposed to be a milestone, a symbol of the success and unity they had built up over the years, but Richard felt uneasy. He swirled the wine glass in his hands, his eyes attentive, capturing his wife's every move. Emily was enchanting, there was no doubt about that. From the start, he had fallen in love with the way she seemed to light up any room. Her vibrant energy was contagious, and he never doubted that she was the kind of woman who drew attention effortlessly. But behind her confident demeanor was a woman who rarely opened up completely. He knew that Emily carried expectations that he often failed to meet, not for lack of desire, but because she seemed to want something more, something he had yet to discover. On the other hand, Emily had her own worries. Richard was everything she could have wished for in a partner, reliable, stable, a man who put his family above all else. But there was something about the routine that had settled between them that left her feeling suffocated. Life seemed to follow a predictable script, each day a reflection of the last, and she missed something that even she couldn't describe. She loved Richard, of that she had no doubt. But loving someone wasn't always enough to fill the voids that arise in life. As she greeted the guests, Emily felt a pair of eyes on her. She looked around and met Richard's gaze. He smiled, and she reciprocated automatically, but inside she felt a small tightness in her chest. She knew that he felt the distance as much as she did. There was an implicit guilt, a feeling that, somewhere along the line, she had failed to match his dedication. The party proceeded with elegance, every detail planned to impress. The guests chatted animatedly about business, travel, and the trivia that sustained their glamorous lives. Richard chatted with a group of investors, but his mind often wandered. He watched as Emily moved around the room, her laughter punctuating the conversations like a pleasant melody. It was impossible to deny that she was still the woman he had fallen in love with, but there was something about her distance that bothered him deeply. Deep down, Richard was a pragmatic man. He believed that problems could be solved, that it was enough to find the heart of the matter and work on a solution. But the feeling that something was slipping through his fingers like fine sand was disconcerting. He had never been a man to back down in the face of a challenge, but now he was faced with something he didn't know how to fight, the silent disconnection between him and the woman he loved most. Emily, for her part, took refuge in the hustle and bustle of the party. Every conversation was a distraction, every smile a way of masking the doubts that plagued her. There were moments when she found herself thinking about the past, about who she was before she became Richard's wife. Before all the pomp and expectations, she was a woman full of dreams of her own, and she wondered where those dreams had fallen by the wayside. As the evening progressed, the hall became more vibrant, the music louder, and the invisible barriers between Richard and Emily seemed to solidify even more. He watched her with a mixture of love and frustration, while she seemed increasingly absorbed in her own world. But there was something in her eyes that intrigued him, a melancholy that she tried to hide. "Is everything all right?" he asked when they were finally alone for a moment. His voice was low, but it carried a weight that couldn't be ignored. Emily hesitated before answering. "Of course, why wouldn't I be?" She smiled, but Richard saw beyond that. It was an empty smile, an automatic reflex that didn't reach her eyes. He knew that answer was just a way of avoiding a deeper conversation, but at that moment, he decided not to press. There would be time for that later, he thought. Meanwhile, the clock kept ticking and the party seemed to be moving in slow motion for Richard. Every laugh, every toast, Emily's every move seemed to carry hidden meanings. He felt like he was watching a game in which he didn't know the rules. And although he didn't want to admit it to himself, he feared what might be hidden behind that detachment. The evening ended with smiles and warm goodbyes. Emily thanked the guests, while Richard remained silent beside her, the weight of his suspicions growing with each passing moment. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew that the truth would somehow find its way to him. And when it did, nothing would ever be the same again. Richard and Emily's routine continued with the same impeccable appearance that always fooled the eyes of others. From the outside, they were an exemplary couple, the reflection of a successful and harmonious life. But inside that luxurious house, there was a screaming silence. Conversations, once spontaneous, were now reduced to a limited repertoire of trivialities. Every gesture seemed calculated, as if they were both avoiding crossing the fine line that separated them from the inevitable confrontation. Richard, however, was not blind. He noticed Emily's furtive glances at her cell phone, the vague smiles that seemed to spring up without explanation. He noticed her increasingly frequent excuses for events that, strangely enough, never involved him. Dinners with friends, work meetings, harmless get-togethers, but always with the same excuse: "Nothing you need to worry about, darling." But he did worry. And more than that, he was suspicious. One day, after yet another of these mysterious outings, Richard decided to confront the evidence, even though his mind was reluctant to accept the possibility. He went through the rooms of the house as if looking for something tangible, a clue that would explain the disconnection that was growing between them. His search led him to the shared closet, where, among the well-organized clothes, he noticed a small suitcase that hadn't been used in a while. Inside, he found a parking ticket from a luxury hotel. He knew that Emily hadn't mentioned anything about being in a hotel. The ticket seemed to burn in his hands, but he didn't have the courage to face her directly. Not yet. He preferred to observe, trying to put the missing pieces together before opening the door to chaos. The next few days were a mixture of tension and silent vigilance. Richard began to observe every detail, every gesture, every excuse Emily made. He began to connect the dots, increasingly convinced that something was wrong. However, he knew he needed more than suspicions, he needed the truth. And that truth, however cruel it might be, was something he was determined to find out. Emily, for her part, continued with her usual routine, unaware that Richard was becoming increasingly attentive. She seemed calm, almost unconcerned, as if she believed that the veil of her excuses was enough to hide whatever she was doing. But there were moments when a gleam of guilt crossed her eyes, moments that Richard didn't let go unnoticed. Then the day of the party arrived. It was a grand event, planned to bring together friends and business partners, a celebration that was supposed to symbolize the stability and success that Richard valued so much. He knew that this would be the ideal moment to observe Emily in her social environment, to see how she behaved when she thought no one was paying attention. He knew that, somehow, this would be the moment when everything would become clear. The party began like any other. Richard circulated among the guests, exchanging smiles and greetings, while Emily played the role of hostess masterfully. But he never let her out of his sight. His eyes followed her every move, every glance she exchanged, every smile that seemed to last a little longer than it should have. And then he saw him. A man, tall and confident, approaching Emily with the familiarity of someone who shouldn't have. The handshake, the lingering gaze, Emily's smile, it all seemed to carry a weight that Richard couldn't ignore. He continued to watch from a distance, his mind fighting against the conclusions that already seemed inevitable. When the music started, Emily and the man took to the dance floor. It was an elegant dance, but there was something more there, something that escaped social conventions. The gestures were too intimate, the looks too deep. Richard felt his blood boil in his veins, but he held back. He knew the explosion would come, but not there, not at that moment. He left the party for a brief moment, going out into the garden to try and catch his breath. His heart seemed to be beating out of rhythm and his mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. He needed to think, he needed to decide how to deal with it. But above all, he needed certainty. He went back into the hall, this time more determined than ever. When he returned, he saw Emily and the man in a far corner, talking intensely. He couldn't hear what they were saying, but the closeness between them spoke louder than any words. Richard felt a lump in his throat, but remained calm. He knew that this would be the last time he would allow Emily to deceive him. He had made his decision. The dance continued, but this time Richard could no longer ignore what he was seeing. He moved closer, but kept enough distance so as not to be noticed. He watched the gestures, the whispers, the smiles. Everything he had feared was there, open before his eyes. Emily was no longer the woman he thought he knew, and betrayal was a reality he could no longer deny. Richard took a deep breath, feeling the weight of every decision he was about to make. He knew that his life would change forever, but at that moment, there was no more room for doubt. He made his way to the center of the hall, where the music was still playing, and drew the attention of all the guests. "I'd like to make an announcement," he said, his voice firm and charged with emotion. Everyone turned to him, including Emily, who looked at him with a mixture of surprise and apprehension. Richard knew that this would be the turning point, the moment when everything would change. As he looked at Emily, he realized that, as devastating as the impact of the betrayal was, there was something bigger behind it all. Something he still didn't fully understand, but which he knew would come to light. And when it did, he would be ready to face whatever truth came. The hall seemed quieter than it should have been, as if the air had been trapped in the guests' throats. Richard remained motionless, his eyes fixed on Emily, who, for the first time that night, seemed really lost. She tried to mumble something, but no sound came out. The man next to her took a step back, as if he wanted to hide in the crowd that was watching him with the same intensity. What had once been a vibrant celebration had now turned into an uncomfortable spectacle of stares and judgments. "You think I didn't know?" Richard's voice rang out again, cutting through the silence like a sharp blade. He didn't shout, but each word carried a force that made the atmosphere heavy. "Do you think I didn't notice the excuses, the strange schedules, the secrets you tried to hide?" Emily took a step forward, raising her hand as if to ask him to stop. "Richard, please, not here," she murmured, her voice trembling. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. It was too late to back down. "Why not here, Emily? Why not let everyone know who you really are? I spent years believing in us, defending you against everything, while you, he took a deep breath, struggling to control the anger that rose like a tide. "While you did it behind my back." She looked around, trying to find support in the faces of her friends, but all she found were expressions of shock and curiosity. There was no refuge. Just Richard, there, exposing every crack in the facade she was trying to keep intact. "I didn't mean it to be like this," Emily finally replied, her voice low, almost inaudible. "I never meant to hurt you." Richard let out a bitter laugh. "Oh, of course. You just wanted to do it away from my eyes, so that I could carry on living in this illusion, didn't you? This isn't about sparing me, Emily. This is about you not wanting to deal with the consequences of your choices." The silence stretched on for a moment that seemed to last an eternity. Emily lowered her eyes, unable to bear the weight of Richard's gaze. "It was a mistake," she whispered, almost pleading. I didn't know how to deal with what I was feeling." "And now you do," he retorted, his tone cold. "Because I know. I know exactly what I'm going to do." Just then, something changed. The intensity in Richard's gaze seemed to diminish, but there was something else there, something more calculated. He reached out and pulled an envelope from his pocket. The room seemed to catch its collective breath as he slowly opened it. "This," he began, his voice taking on a controlled tone that seemed more dangerous than any shout, "is proof that you were never really on my side, Emily. Not only did you destroy our marriage, you tried to destroy everything I built." He pulled out a set of papers from inside the envelope and held them up for her to see. Her eyes widened as she recognized the documents. She took a step back, as if the printed words were a gun pointed directly at her. "You didn't think I'd know, did you?" he continued, addressing not just her, but everyone in the room. "You thought I wouldn't find out that while you were saying you needed time, you were signing contracts with lawyers to try and take half my company. You thought I was a fool." Emily opened her mouth, but no defense came out. Her expression was one of absolute panic, as if her entire carefully planned strategy had collapsed in front of her. She tried to reach out to Richard, but he took a step back. "Please let me explain," she finally managed to say, her voice desperate. "It wasn't what you think, Richard. Not what I think." He laughed again, an empty sound, devoid of any humor. "You were getting ready to break up with me, Emily. And while you were doing that, while you were wearing the mask of a devoted wife, I was already preparing myself too." He then turned his attention to the guests, his voice now loud and clear. "For weeks, I knew. I knew about the betrayal. I knew about the lover." He looked directly at the man next to Emily, who now looked paler than the champagne in the hand of one of the guests. "And now everyone here knows." The crowd murmured, shocked, but no one dared interrupt him. Richard turned to Emily again, his eyes brimming with something between sadness and determination. "You wanted control, you wanted to take everything away from me. But I did what I should have done a long time ago. I protected everything that was mine." He put the documents back in the envelope and threw it on the nearest table. "You'll have nothing, Emily. Not the house, not the company, not my respect." Emily fell to her knees, the tears finally breaking through the barrier she had tried to maintain. "I made a mistake," she repeated, her voice breaking. "But I loved you, Richard. I've always loved you." He watched her for a moment, his expression hardening. "Maybe you did, at some point. But that doesn't matter anymore. Because now, Emily, I know exactly who you are. And you're going to learn what it means to lose everything." The hall remained absolutely silent as Richard walked away, each step echoing on the marble floor. Emily stood there, alone, her broken figure contrasting with the luxurious setting around her. And in the air, there was only the certainty that this was only the beginning of the price she would have to pay. The night seemed to drag on in slow motion as Richard left the hall, ignoring the stares and whispers that followed him. Rain had started to fall outside, a perfect contrast to the chaos he was leaving behind. He walked aimlessly, feeling the gravity of events weighing heavily on his shoulders. It wasn't just his marriage that had fallen apart, it was trust, respect, everything he had believed to be unshakable. And yet, something inside him kept pulsing, a force that kept him going. Emily was still kneeling in the center of the hall, her hands shaking and her mind in a whirl. The guests hesitated between leaving discreetly or offering some kind of consolation, but no one knew what to say. She looked up and saw her lover still standing a few meters away, his expression a mixture of guilt and helplessness. "Aren't you going to say anything?" she asked, her voice hoarse, almost inaudible. He hesitated before answering. "What do you want me to say, Emily? You knew this could happen. You knew it was a risk." His words hit like a blow. It was true, but hearing it at that moment only made everything crueler. She stood up slowly, ignoring the stares around her, and walked over to him. "I thought you were by my side," she said, her voice full of hurt. "I was," he replied, looking away. "But this has gone too far. I can't be here now." And before she could say anything else, he walked away, disappearing into the crowd that was beginning to disperse. Emily stood still, alone, feeling the emptiness spreading inside her. Everything she thought she had control over, everything she had planned, was in ruins. She didn't know where to go, but she knew she couldn't stay there. Hours later, Richard was in his home office, staring at the burning fireplace. The flickering light illuminated the papers he had organized on the table. He was trying to concentrate, trying to plot his next move, but the image of Emily kneeling in the hall kept invading his mind. There was something about her at that moment that he couldn't ignore. It wasn't just guilt or shame, it was something deeper, something he couldn't decipher. The sound of the front door being opened brought him out of his thoughts. He stood up quickly, knowing who it was. Emily walked in, drenched by the rain, her face pale and her eyes swollen from crying. She stopped in the hallway, hesitating, and then walked over to him, as if she were carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. "I know you don't want to see me," she began, her voice trembling. "But I had to come. I had to try to explain." Richard crossed his arms, maintaining a cold expression. "Explain what?" "That you destroyed everything. That you tried to deceive me in every possible way." "I'm not going to defend myself," she replied, shaking her head. "There are no excuses for what I did. But there are things you don't know." He laughed bitterly. "Oh, of course. There always are. And will these things, Emily, change the fact that you betrayed me? That you tried to destroy me?" She swallowed, her hands shaking slightly. "I know it won't. But I need you to understand. I didn't do it because I didn't love you. I did it because I was afraid." "Afraid?" Richard raised an eyebrow. "Afraid of what, Emily? Success? Of stability? What more could you want?" "Fear of losing everything," she whispered, lowering her gaze. "I know it sounds absurd now, but I felt suffocated, Richard. Not because you did anything wrong, but because I didn't know who I was anymore. Everything seemed to slip out of my control. And then, when I met him, it was an escape, I know. It was stupid and selfish, but it seemed easy." Richard was silent for a moment, trying to process her words. He wanted to feel angry, he wanted to shout, but instead he felt something unexpected, tiredness. "And what did you hope to get out of it, Emily?" he asked, his voice lower. "Did you really think it would make you happy? That destroying everything we built together would give you some kind of relief?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she took a step forward, looking directly into his eyes. "I don't know what I expected. But what I do know is that there's nothing now. And it's all my fault." For a brief moment, they were both silent, just staring at each other. There was so much to be said, so many things unresolved, but neither of them knew where to start. Until Emily finally broke the silence. "I know I've lost you, Richard. I know I've lost everything. But if there's anything I can do, anything to try and make it right, I will." He watched her for a long time, his emotions oscillating between anger and something he didn't want to admit, empathy. But there was something else he knew needed to be said, something she still didn't fully understand. "Do you want to fix this?" he finally asked, his voice carrying an intensity that made Emily hold her breath. "Then start by accepting that there's no going back. There's no erasing what you've done. But maybe there's still a way to understand why it all came to this." She nodded slowly, her eyes filling with tears again. "I'll do whatever it takes." Richard took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her words. He knew that the road ahead would be difficult, full of questions that neither of them wanted to answer. But at that moment, as the rain continued to fall outside, he decided to take the first step. Not for her, not even for them, but for himself. Because, despite everything, he knew he had to find closure for the chapter they had written together, even if it meant starting from scratch. The rain continued to fall outside, echoing softly against the windows as Richard sat in the living room. The silence between him and Emily was heavy, filled only by the sound of the clock on the wall, marking time with ruthless punctuality. She was sitting on the other side of the room, her eyes fixed on the floor as she wrung her hands nervously. Neither of them seemed to know how to continue after the confrontation they had had. He felt an overwhelming tiredness set in, not just physically, but emotionally. It was as if the last few years of his life were crumbling in front of him, and every word spoken that night had drained a chunk of his energy. He leaned back on the sofa, staring at the flames in the fireplace, which flickered as if reflecting the chaos consuming his mind. Emily tried to speak, but her voice failed her at first. Finally, she managed, "I need to know what happens now." Her voice was almost a whisper, and the weight of the question hung in the air between them. Richard didn't look away from the fireplace as he answered. "I'd like to know too. But honestly, Emily, I don't have all the answers right now." She stood up, walking slowly through the space, as if the movement could help her organize her own thoughts. "I don't expect you to forgive me. Not now, maybe not ever. But I can't live with this uncertainty, with this silence." Silence. He turned to face her, his voice laden with bitterness. "This silence, Emily, is the sound of what's left. Have you ever thought about what it took to get to this point? I built this life for us. I gave it everything I had. And now, here we are." She stopped, the tears threatening to fall again, but resisted. "I know what I've lost. I know what I've done. But, Richard, you also have to admit that we lost each other long before that." He laughed, a short, humorless sound. "Oh, right, so now it's my fault too. What else, Emily? Are you going to tell me that I should have danced more often, looked at you differently, realized beforehand that you were planning to end it all?" "I'm not trying to blame you," she replied, her voice firm but with a vulnerability that momentarily disarmed him. "I'm saying that we both let it happen. We both ignored the signs, the voids that grew between us. And I chose the wrong path. But don't think for a second that you're exempt from responsibility." He stared at her for a long moment, trying to process what she was saying. He knew, on some level, that there was truth in her words. Their marriage hadn't deteriorated overnight. The cracks were there, small and almost invisible at first, but they grew until everything fell apart. Even so, accepting this was a monumental task, and he wasn't ready to admit as much. "You still don't understand," he finally said. "No matter how bad things were between us. You chose to betray. You chose to lie. And that choice, that's all yours." She nodded, silently accepting his words. "I know. And I'll pay for it, Richard. I'm already paying." The weight of the conversation left them exhausted, and the night seemed endless. Richard went into the kitchen to get a glass of water, trying to clear his head. As he looked out of the window at the unrelenting rain, he felt something different. It wasn't exactly anger or sadness, but something close to emptiness. He went back into the living room and saw that Emily was still there, but there was something different about her posture. She seemed smaller, more fragile than he had ever seen her before. For the first time that night, he realized the extent of the devastation they had both caused. It wasn't just him who was broken, she was too. "What now, Emily?" he asked, his voice calmer. "What do you really want?" She raised her eyes, and he could see a painful honesty in them. "I want to try to understand what happened. I want to try to make things right, even if it doesn't mean saving our marriage. I want you not to hate me forever." Richard sighed, running his hands through his hair. "Hate doesn't solve anything, Emily. But neither does trying to fix what's beyond repair. Perhaps the best thing we can do now is to move on, apart." The words hung in the air, final and full of sadness. She nodded slowly, as if she already knew that this was the only possible answer. But even so, hearing it from the man she loved was like one last stab. "I'll pack my things," she said, her voice almost fading. "I'll leave in the morning." Richard just nodded, saying nothing more. He knew that nothing he said now would change what had already been decided. As she went upstairs, he returned to the sofa, feeling more alone than ever. But deep down, something told him that this loneliness was just the beginning of something bigger. Something he still couldn't fully understand, but which would be necessary to rebuild his life from scratch. And maybe he wasn't as alone as he thought. The silence the next morning was different. It was no longer the weight of an unfinished argument or the tension of a tumultuous night. It was the kind of silence that comes with acceptance, with the recognition that everything had finally changed. Richard woke up early, before the sun had even risen, and went straight to the office. He needed to organize his thoughts, draw up a plan for moving forward. While adjusting the papers on his desk, he heard the faint sound of Emily coming down the stairs. She was carrying a small suitcase and wore a simple outfit, without the elegance she usually displayed. She looked smaller, more fragile. When their gazes met, neither of them spoke immediately. There was a mutual feeling that the words had already been used up. "I'm going," she finally said, her voice low and firm. "I won't bother you anymore." Richard just nodded. He wanted to say something, but no words seemed sufficient or appropriate. He didn't know whether to feel relief, sadness, or a combination of both. Emily hesitated for a moment at the door, as if she expected him to call her back. But he didn't. She left, and the door closed softly behind her. Richard stood in the same place, listening to the sound of her car driving away. That was it. The end of a story that he believed would last forever. In the days that followed, Richard immersed himself in work. He knew he needed to keep his mind occupied, to avoid the emptiness that constantly threatened to consume him. But there was something different about him now, a clarity that hadn't existed before. He didn't just want to rebuild his life, he wanted to learn from what had happened. The betrayal had been a devastating blow, but also a revelation about himself, about what he was willing to accept and what he would never allow again. Meanwhile, Emily faced a different path. Without the comfort of the home she shared with Richard or the stability he had provided, she was forced to look inwards, to confront the reasons that had led her to destroy something so valuable. She began therapy, something she had always avoided, and gradually came to understand the old wounds that had never fully healed. It was a painful but necessary process. The months passed, and the distance between them was not just physical, but emotional. Richard started attending social events again, something he had abandoned for years. At one of these events, he met Claire, a woman who seemed to bring a lightness he didn't know he needed. She was different from Emily in every way, simple, straightforward, and with a vision of life that inspired him to be better. They started out as friends, but over time something more emerged. For the first time in a long time, Richard felt hope. Emily, on the other hand, was facing the reality of her new life. Without Richard's financial support, she had to start from scratch. She got a job in a small company and rented a modest apartment. It wasn't the life she was used to, but there was an unexpected freedom in it. She was finally learning to support herself, to find value in things she had previously ignored. Fate, however, had one last play for them both. A year later, Richard and Emily met by chance in a coffee shop. It was a strange moment, full of tension and nostalgia. They greeted each other politely, and Emily noticed that he seemed different, more relaxed, happier. She knew that he had moved on and, for the first time, she felt that she could do the same. "You look well," she said, with a shy smile. "I am," he replied sincerely. "And you?" She hesitated, but answered honestly. "I'm still learning, but I think I'm on the right track." There was a pause, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was as if they both recognized that the past, although painful, had led them to places where they could finally find peace. When they said goodbye, there were no promises to keep in touch or try to recover what had been lost. Just a mutual understanding that this was the last piece of a story that needed to be closed. Richard returned to his life with Claire and, over time, they built something solid, based on mutual trust and respect. Emily continued on her way, finding small moments of joy in her newfound independence. They both learned the importance of facing their own demons before blaming the other for their failings. This wasn't just a story about betrayal. It was a story about choices, consequences, and the painful but necessary journey to find oneself. Now that you've made it this far, I want to know, what did you think of this story? Comment your opinion below and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on the next impactful stories we bring you. Remember, this channel does not support any form of betrayal. Our aim is to show how these choices can destroy lives and relationships. See you next time.